Chapter 1. Fantasyland. Lena Morris loves having control over money. Rich men's money, to be exact. Money. That was what Lena knew to be the driving force of the world. Money and success, but weren't they kind of the same thing in most people's eyes? That's why she lived by the book and did things in order. She got her master's degree in business and finance. She got engaged to the son of the owner of a chain of hotels. That was her job as a financial consultant. The walk from the car garage to the yoga studio was brisk and cold. March in Philadelphia was too cold, Lena thought. For some people, an average temperature of 53 degrees was fair, maybe even pleasant, but that wasn't the case for Lena Morris. She did not like the cold. In fact, anything under 70 degrees pretty much felt like a curse to her. She shrugged her yoga mat bag over her shoulder, and shoved her hands deep into her pockets and cursed the wind. The wind made everything worse. People only liked the wind when it was 90 degrees or when they wanted to go sailing. The wind was overrated. To Lena, lots of things were overrated. Social media for starters. And big fat weddings. That was the last thing she wanted. She wanted a simple life, at least, that's what she had convinced herself to believe. And that was precisely the kind of life she was living, the cookie-cutter good girl who went to school and waited until after college to get engaged kind of life. But honestly, it wasn't all that. She was drowning in boring. Her job as a financial consultant for Green Consulting Group was a good job that a lot of people were gunning for. It was steady, reliable, paid well. She had benefits. All that good stuff. And she was good at it. But it was boring. She went to an office every day and talked on the phone and sifted through paperwork in Excel sheets and ledgers. The walls were blank except for the generic, abstract paintings in the elevator hall. Really, for a good rich company, she would have thought that they would put some of their time and energy into making the place more appealing. Basically, everyone could relate to things that looked pleasing to the eye. That's what got people's attention in most instances. It was what had attracted her fiancé, Brian Barkley, at a random seminar in Cincinnati 3 years ago. She'd gone to schmooze some corporate men that wanted to invest in the Green Consulting Group. In fact, her slightly above average looks were probably what attracted those men at first as well. Lena rolled her eyes as she thought about what those types of men were like. They talked down to you and commented on your appearance and your age when you were a woman. They questioned your position and your competency, and she didn't appreciate that. But she did love basically having control over their money. It was what they held most dear to them after all. It gave her some satisfaction to secretly have the upper hand in those cases. Well, it wasn't necessarily secretly, but it was usually quiet enough to hear the gears in their little brains turning, when they explained to them what their fiscal year might look like, and how to develop better financial strategies to accommodate for that. It was probably her main pleasure in life. Yes, she had a good job and a fiancé in her own home, but none of those things really pleased her. Instead, she saw them as a checklist for success. How else was she supposed to get her parents' love and affection? That kind of stuff didn't come free. So yeah, in her parents' eyes and in society's eyes, she was a young, beautiful, successful lady with her whole life ahead of her. But when she looked in the mirror, she just saw a decent-looking body that fit the mold. But it was basic vanilla. She wanted chocolate-dipped cherries. Not vanilla. Just as Lena approached the building where her Fornitsock yoga class was located, she spotted something very pleasing to her eye. He stopped her at the door that she realized someone was holding open for her. But she didn't have the sense to walk through. No, all of her senses were locked on the man, probably 6'3" and very toned under his suit jacket. His dusky skin complemented his medium-length curly dark hair. In the sunset, his hair was like black tourmaline, and his eyes, they were too bright and captivating for as dark as they were. They almost seemed black the closer he got. Everything about him was dark. He was definitely not vanilla, she thought as he walked towards her. He was looking straight at her, and when their eyes met after she'd done a slightly shameful thorough exploration of his physical traits, he didn't drop his gaze. He was completely undisguised. "You goin' in?" he asked, opening the door the other kind person had long abandoned. Even his voice was dark and deep, like the purest dark maple syrup. Lena cleared her throat and said, yes, thank you." She walked through so as not to make the moment any more awkward, but she couldn't help but turn around as she passed by him. He grinned down at her confidently, squinting his eyes slightly, which gave him an air of, "Yeah, I know I'm attractive. I see you seeing me." Lena let out a little embarrassed puff of hair and turned around quickly. She wished she was brave enough to be that obvious. She left the tall, dark mystery man and walked quickly to the elevator and waited. Instead of watching the red numbers change like she usually did, she kept looking out the window, hoping that he would come through the door, walk up to her, and tell her how attractive he thought she was. The bell for the elevator's arrival dinged sharply. shattering her reverie. She entered it and went up to the third floor where her yoga class took place. Her friend Adrian greeted her warmly, like usual, and then the class began. Lena usually tried not to get too close to people because when you get close to them they expect a lot, and then you have to do all of these things to keep them interested in you, but Adrian seemed different. She was very bubbly and sweet. She treated everyone like she had been their best friend since grade school.
No judgment.
Really, she was like a breath of fresh air, and even though Adrian was the one who had worn Lena down enough to open up, Lena was pretty sure she was more attached, and that scared her. She wasn't attached to anyone, not even her fiancé. As much as she knew it was wrong, or that it shouldn't be the way it was, Lena had yet to entertain, let alone express, any thoughts about leaving him. He was safe. He was a good box for her to check off on her success list. But she wanted more than just success at this point in her life. She was already 27, and she was tired of vanilla. She wanted that chocolate-dipped cherry, that dark rich maple syrup. Not the store-bought syrup that was golden and delicate. She wanted the robust stuff with the strong taste. Brian was golden and delicate, but that man on the street who had opened the door for her, he was robust, strong, and she couldn't help but see him every time the instructor told the class to close their eyes. Brian was the type to hold her hand in the car, but she imagined this guy would be the type to slide his hand to her inner thigh. Brian was the type to touch her gently on the shoulder and kiss her on the cheek, but this guy was probably the kind that would seize her by the waist, press his whole body against her and smash his lips to hers. Brian always apologized when Lena caught him staring at her, but this guy, he would unabashedly scan her body and give her his best bedroom eyes. She spent most of her time in yoga class enthralled by that fantasy land where she was with dark maple. You can only get this commercially syrup guy, not golden safe. Just drizzle on your pancake syrup guy. Chapter 2. A moment off duty. Ransom Giudice was a whole half of a block away from her when he saw her clutching her yoga bag over her shoulder. Her face was what struck him first. It wasn't her clear complexion or her light green eyes that complemented her auburn hair so well that attracted him at first, though he noticed them and appreciated them once he got closer. No, it was her scowl. She looked so displeased with something. Judging by her big coat and her red cheeks, it was probably the weather. He swore he could see her mouth moving, cursing the sharp chill of the wind. And the way her eyebrows furrowed together and made her eyes darken was so serious it was cute. He had no intention of stopping her and talking to her, let alone opening the door for her, but then she met his gaze and his stomach nearly dropped out of his SS. He wasn't expecting such intensity. He was intrigued, so he didn't break their gaze. When she also refused to look away as they neared each other on the sidewalk, he couldn't help but smile at her. She was overtly attracted to him. He had caught women's gazes before. They usually blushed and looked away. On a rare occasion, a woman would wink at him or smile coyly. Once he was even catcalled from across the street. But this lady was different. Usually, he would reprimand anyone who dared to veer from their directive, but he was basically the boss, so he could do whatever he wanted. He decided to take a moment and step away from his mission so he could interact with her just for a second. He assumed the cute woman was going into the building, which had a yoga studio on the third floor. He checked out her bottom half. Her legs were shapely, and her thighs were the best kind of thick. He wished she wasn't wearing such a bulky coat so he could see the rest of her, but he honestly felt like he wouldn't mind if she didn't have big breasts or a flat stomach. Those things were overrated anyway. She was super cute though, he thought. He grabbed the cool metal handle of the door and pulled it open just as she arrived. "You going in?" he asked. The woman paused in front of him. She was fairly tall, probably 5'7" or so in her tennis shoes since the top of her head was about level with his shoulder. She looked up with him, her bottom lip sucked nervously between her teeth. Her cheeks were red from the wind, but he could see a gleam of embarrassment in her eyes. So maybe she wasn't as conspicuous as he thought. He grinned down at her. What was she going to do now? Ignore him like the other women? She cleared her throat and nodded. Yes, thank you, she said. Then she stepped calmly into the building and left him standing there with the door open. He was almost tempted to follow her and ask her name, but he reminded himself that he was trying to get a nasty task taken care of, and she was just a distraction. A beautiful, intriguing, pleasant distraction. She walked quickly to the elevator and pressed the up button. He closed the door and watched her for a moment, appreciating the simplicity of their interaction. She hadn't run away after he'd spoken to her. She hadn't hit on him. She actually met his eyes and spoke to him. That was nice, new. You see, for Ransom, he was used to people running away from him. That's what happened when you were the underboss of one of the big 5 mafia families in Philadelphia. Not a lot of people knew the face that matched the name, but after they found out, they usually weren't too keen on sticking around him unless they wanted something. protection or profit usually. He appreciated this little moment, this little break from work, but it was time to get back to it. Ransom was out wandering the business district looking for someone in particular. When you're in the mafia, especially as a boss, usually you go after people who owe you money. Money was what made the world go round, and it was especially what made the underworld go round. And when someone tried to tip the balance of the world or slow its orbit, Ransom was the guy who tracked him down and then had his guys take care of setting things straight. Tommy Berrialias was a new client of the Giudice Mafia, and he still hadn't learned his manners. He still needed a few classes on etiquette. Ransom was all about teaching etiquette, respect, and he did so with thin patience and a firm hand. That's what you had to do. And if people like Tommy didn't get it after the first couple of lessons, then Ransom had to send the other guys in, the mean guys, and he didn't like to do that. So he was off to find Tommy Berrialias and let him know he'd messed up and that there wasn't a large margin for error in his business. Not now, not with father and son Giudice involved. The thing about guys like Tommy Berrialias was that they usually responded well to stern lectures because they were smart and they knew what would happen if they didn't show up, if they didn't get the money they owed. Ransom was glad to have people like that. He didn't want to have to hurt anyone. He was just doing the job he was raised to do. As Ransom rounded the corner of the building, he found himself looking over his shoulder, something he didn't generally feel the need to do. He knew that woman wouldn't be back there, but something about her made him want to turn around if it meant getting to look at her face again. How unfortunate that he would probably never see her again, not in a busy city like Philly. Luckily, Tommy was easy to find. He always parked in the same place on the 5th level of the parking garage. He drove a nice car, a BMW Buick 8 Series Grand Coupe. There weren't too many of those around, even in the business district. Ransom waited by his car until Tommy popped out of the elevator. "Ui, Tommy, how's it going?" Ransom called out. Tommy froze in his tracks and nearly dropped his keys and his phone. "Careful, buddy," Ransom said. "Didn't mean to startle you. I just came to have a little chat. That's all it is." Tommy hesitated to keep moving forward. Now this is how people approached him. That was, if they had any sense. Chapter 3: Daydream to Nightmare. Lena's mind continued to wander as she pressed her hips back and up in downward-facing dog. She imagined the firm ground her palms were pressing into were mystery maple syrup guy's pecs. Sometime in her daydream of him, she had begun to think of him as the man on all of the cringy romance book covers where the male lead was holding his damsel in an uncomfortable, yet sexy, embrace while his shirt was seemingly blown open by the wind. He'd become that guy. And she'd become the female lead who was arched back in his arms with one of her legs hiked up around his waist. His hand would be precariously high on her bare thigh which showed through the long slit in the skirt of her dress. He would be staring down either at the beauty of her face or her fair and ample bosom. "Step to the top of your mat, and slowly make your way to standing," the yoga instructor said. Lena heard her, but she was too deep in her reverie to respond until her friend Adrian slapped Lena in the thigh with the back of her hand and snapped her out of it. Reality was harsh. Reality made her feel guilty because in reality she was engaged, and she knew she shouldn't be fantasizing about other men. Lena rooted down through her feet and opened her palms to the front as the class stood in mountain pose. The instructor told them to press their hands into prayer, and Lena followed along. This part was muscle memory, and she could do it on autopilot. She wasn't like Adrian, who always seemed revived and renewed each time class ended. Adrian always seemed to get something spiritual out of yoga, while Lena did it purely for health reasons. When Adrian heard Lena talk about how unaffected she felt, Adrian would tell her to get out of her own way, get out of her own head, and she would see the world differently. But it wasn't that easy. At the end of class, Adrian and Lena parted ways outside on the sidewalk in front of the building. Adrian lived close by while Lena parked in the parking garage in the opposite direction. Adrian made Lena promise to go get a cup of coffee soon, and then she said goodbye. Lena cursed the wind and the cold chill of the night as she walked alone to the parking garage. It was usually not a creepy walk, but in the right place at the wrong time, anywhere in Philly could become creepy really quickly. And that is precisely what happened when Lena suddenly heard a man screaming for help, as she made it up to her level of the parking garage. "Ow! Please don't. Please, I'll have it in a couple of days, I promise," the man screamed. He sounded so desperate and in so much pain. Lena slowed down and started to get her phone out to call 911. She crouched down between a couple of cars and peered underneath them. Several vehicles down, she saw a man lying on the ground on his back, and there were 2 sets of shoes standing on either side of him. "I'm begging you, please," the man said again. I promise I'll have it this time. It's just been a hard month is all. I promise I'll have the money. April." A loud thud stopped the man from finishing his desperate cry. She froze in surprise and sank to the pavement. What was she supposed to do? She didn't have any self-defense training. She was a tallish woman with a resting beige face, but her voice wasn't that intimidating, so she didn't have much of a scare factor. She couldn't face these two men, and it would be a death trap if she interfered right then. She stayed there, pinned against the car. As she listened to the poor man on the ground get cursed at and threatened and get punched and kicked, she felt bad that she couldn't do anything. Finally, when it was quiet, and she heard the footsteps of the assailants recede, she peeked around the taillights of the car. It seemed to be clear, and she could hear the man wheezing and coughing and mumbling for help. She got up and ran to him. When she approached, his face was bloodied and swollen, and one of his hands was definitely broken. A couple of his fingers were bent in the wrong direction. She almost wanted to hurl at the sight of him, but she took a deep, not exactly calm breath and pulled her phone out of her pocket. "Are you okay, sir?" She wanted to punch herself. Of course he wasn't okay. That was such a stupid thing to ask. "I'm calling someone right now." Just as she dialed the 9, her phone was slapped out of her hands. It clattered across the concrete floor. Lena looked up at whoever had just done that. It was a tan man with dark hair that was shaved nearly down to the scalp. He was clean-shaven but still looked rugged. His eyes were a strange kind of brown that she'd never seen before, and just as she was trying to zone in on his face, he swung at her, knocking her to the ground. Her head slammed into the concrete and a sharp buzzing rang through her head. She tried to open her eyes, but the whole world had gone topsy-turvy, and it was in black and white. She tried to blink away the pain, and she heard a strange disembodied grunting. Then suddenly her head was being wrenched back, and her head was being covered with something. She tried to scream, but a hand clapped over her mouth to silence her. Her first thought was to bite the hand, so she tried, and she got a chunk of what felt like the webbing between the index finger and thumb, but she was smack dizzy again, and this time she couldn't keep her eyes open. She drifted off into a terribly uncomfortable unconscious state. When Lena awoke again, her head was still ringing, and her vision was a bit blurry. It took her a moment to blink away the static-like world and come to her senses. She tried to brush her hair off of her face and out of her eyes, but her arm was restrained. In fact, both of her arms were restrained. She tried to move her legs, but they felt heavy. She discovered that her waist was tied down as well. In a panic, she began to thrash against the ropes tying her to the chair, but it was no use. She was too weak. She huffed tiredly and looked around the room. It seemed like she was in a large basement-like place, and it was cold here. She began to yell because that was the only other thing she could think of to do, but as soon as she started, 2 men busted through the metal door and charged towards her. Lena couldn't help but flinch and shut her mouth. Who the heck were these people? Why did they kidnap her? She slowly began to recall the moments before she was knocked out. The bloodied man on the ground, the 2 men beating him, the man with the cinnamon-colored eyes who had probably been the one to knock her out. "Who the hell are you?" he spat at her. She furrowed her brows angrily. She had no idea what was going on, but it was all wrong. "Who the hell are you?" she bit back. Chapter 4. The Dark Maple Syrup Guy. To Lena's surprise, she was more irritated than anything when she found herself tied to a chair in some sketchy basement with 2 sketchy dudes staring down at her, and demanding her to tell them who she was. It wasn't like she found herself in these types of circumstances often. In fact, the most intense interaction she'd had with a stranger was when she accidentally grabbed his coffee cup instead of hers, and he chased her down and yanked it out of her hand and shoved hers in her hand in place of it. Thinking back, even that interaction might not have been so horrible. That guy might have been a little mean, but he did give her her coffee. He certainly didn't have to do that. He could have just left it sitting on the counter, cooling and free to be snatched up by some other absent-minded woman. "Listen, I don't know who you are, and I feel like I shouldn't have to tell you who I am. Why are you going around kidnapping people when you don't know who they are? What if I'm some kind of spy or FBI agent or something?" she said indignantly. The guy with the cinnamon-colored eyes bent over and peered into her eyes. He was too close. She could smell the cigarette stink on his breath. She leaned back from him and turned her face away. "I guess that would give us a good reason to kill you then," he hissed. Lena scrunched up her nose as his odor filled her nose until she felt like she was eating it. She coughed. "Could you back up? Your breath reeks, man." The guy stood up and stared down at her like he wanted to kill her. She clenched her teeth, thinking that considering she didn't know who she was dealing with, she shouldn't be so mouthy. But she knew that power was all in the eye contact, so she held his gaze despite the boiling rage in his eyes. Just when she thought he was going to give up, he lifted up his hand and slapped her across the face with the back of his hand. Lena was taken by surprise, and she let out a small yelp of pain. She wanted to hold the stink on her cheek with her hands, but she couldn't. You little BT. Who do you think you are? He yelled at her. The other guy, a younger pale-faced kid with light brown hair, grabbed his buddy by the arm and yanked him back. Don't do that. The boss'll be mad, he muttered.
Leena laughed sardonically.
There was another one? A boss? That didn't sound good. Usually, the bosses were twice the persiques as their understudies. At the sound of her exasperated laughing, the cinnamon-eyed guy approached her and grabbed her by the hair. She winced and tried to turn her face away again. Didn't you hear that? Your boss will be mad if you hurt me, Leena growled. The man squeezed her hair tighter and pulled, wrenching her head back. She was getting really sick of this guy. Why was he so damn aggressive? I said, get your dirty hands off of me, she yelled, swinging her leg up and kicking the guy in the groin. He instantly released his hold on her hair and crumpled to the floor. The kid watched in shock as his buddy writhed on the floor, clutching himself. She thought she noticed a little smirk in the corner of his mouth. At least this kid didn't seem as bad as the other guy. Leena watched with a pleased gleam in her eye as the man groaned and eventually staggered up to his feet. He was glowering with utter fury. It was a bit intimidating, but she didn't want to show him that. He made to lunge back at her, but to her relief, the kid grabbed him and pulled him back. She tried not to be too obvious about the alleviation she felt. Who knew what the guy would do next time he laid his hands on her? She was curious, though, about what the kid had said. Their boss would be angry if they hurt her? Why was that? Who were these guys and what did they want with her anyway? Just as she was about to ask about the man, the one she'd seen them beat up in the parking garage, the door creaked open and a big dark figure walked through. There was something familiar about this person for some reason. Let's get this over with, he said with a deep, sugary voice. He raked his hand through his dark, curly hair and finally looked up at her. Dark maple syrup guy, she mumbled to herself. Ransom nearly lost his composure when he saw her. They'd just seen each other earlier that night in front of the building with the yoga studio. She was the cute woman who had given him the slow and very obvious once-over. He had to swallow his laugh of irony. He was not expecting to see her. He was almost happy to see her. He had been hoping to catch another glimpse of her green eyes before leaving her earlier, but after she looked back at him that last time he'd gone on his way. What was she doing here? He wondered, his mouth twisting into a frown as he realized the severity of the situation. More importantly, who was she? The boys had sent word that they caught a woman who saw them beat up Tommy. He walked closer to her and looked closer at her face. Her eyes were wide and bright with disbelief and amazement, and the way her face flushed instantly as they made eye contact. Apparently she was kind of happy to see him too. He nearly let himself smile at how readable she was. It was adorable. He approached her, crossing his arms over his chest, cocking his head side to side as he examined her closer. That's when he noticed that her right cheek was redder than the other. He pointed at her face and looked over his shoulder. What the hell is this? He asked gruffly. Manny shifted uncomfortably and shrugged. I don't know what you mean, sir, he said, not meeting Ransom's eyes. Ransom flicked his gaze over to the kid, Mateo. Mateo was a good kid, respectable. He followed orders. Manny, on the other hand, had always been more amped up and aggressive. Ransom should have taken more time to consider letting him in before he did. Based on what he knew to be true about these two guys, he already knew what had happened in his absence, but if there was one thing that helped him weed out weak soldiers, it was little tests like this. He didn't need any liars. A liar was a liability. That's why they were called liars. That start hit me. That's what this is, the girl said from behind him. He turned around, not expecting to hear her voice. There it was again. That scowl. She stared past him now at the two soldiers standing behind him. Which one of you hit her? He asked without turning around to face them. The girl shook her hair off of her face but never broke her angry gaze away from her assailant. She was feisty. She was brave. He liked that. Chapter 5. Who are you? When neither of the guys said anything, Ransom swirled around to look at them. He gave them a good warning glare. Now's your chance to speak, he said sternly. Mateo was still and steady, but Ransom could sense that he was itching to say something. Manny stared at the ground. That told him enough, but he wanted to hear them admit it. It's a lot easier to talk when all of your teeth are still in your mouth, Ransom said flatly. He didn't like handling matters that way, but sometimes it was the only way to get a stubborn jacks like Manny to speak. It was Manny, Mateo said, finally cracking under the pressure. He was a smart kid. He knew who was the boss in the room. He knew he had to stand up for himself. You know that's not how we do things, Ransom said to him. Manny gasped. What? You're just going to believe him? Ransom shot daggers at Manny to shut him up. He didn't have to say anything. I already knew. And since when did you think it was okay to rough someone up like this without my say-so? Manny snapped his mouth shut and looked down at the ground. I'm sorry, sir, he muttered. Ransom scoffed and waved his hand to dismiss them. He wanted a moment alone with the woman. Get out. I'll deal with you in a minute. Mateo faltered and a small, smug smile crept onto his face. Take it easy on Manny later. The girl already got her payback. Manny grunted and yanked the door open angrily. Mateo stifled a laugh. When Ransom turned back to the woman, she was looking up at him with excited nervousness. He chuckled lightly and bent down at her feet. As he untied the rope around her wrists, her eyes stayed fixed on his face. He wasn't sure anyone had ever looked at him for such a long period of time before. He had to go around the back of the chair to get out of her gaze before he became bothered. She was making him want to stare back. Maybe touch her along the chin or something. But he didn't do that. He wasn't supposed to do that. Before Ransom let the rope fall, he said softly next to her ear, Don't run off, Kay? He heard her breath stutter a bit, and he couldn't help but smile. What was this? He had never met anyone like her before. When the rope fell, she stayed still. She didn't even rub her wrists where the ropes had been tied. He walked around in front of her again and crossed his arms again. What was he going to do with her? Before I let you go, I have a few questions, he said. She finally looked down and turned her face away. You're being awfully quiet. Are you always like that? He asked her. He couldn't help but be intrigued by her. She looked so fiery and confident in her eyes, but she was composed, maybe shy, maybe just guarded. He didn't know yet. Lena was suddenly very intimidated by this man. She found it difficult at first to tear her eyes off of him, but now that he was standing before her again with his large arms crossed over his chest and his firm eyes looking down at her, she wasn't sure what to do or say. She shrugged. It wasn't that she was a shy person in general, though it was true she was standoffish and quiet in many social situations until her input was needed. It was more that she was confused about what was happening inside of her. In her mind, she knew that this type of situation was not good. She had literally been kidnapped. She was talking to her kidnapper's boss. But her body was betraying her. At the sight of this dark, mighty man, she felt so small, inferior. Then the way he untied her wrist so gently, the way his voice sounded, husky and colored with amusement when he told her not to run away. It all made her belly sink and quiver. Then there was her heart. It was beating so fast, she felt like she had just hiked up a mountain or something. What was all of that about? She'd never felt that before. What's your name? He asked. Lena cleared her throat. Elena.
Lena Morris.
Lena Morris. What do you do for a living? Ooh, she liked the way her name sounded coming out of his mouth. In her mind, she kicked herself for thinking these absurd things. She nearly missed his second question. I'm a financial consultant for Green Consulting Group. The man narrowed his eyes at her, as if he were trying to deduce whether she was telling the truth or not. He inspected her face and body from his spot a couple of feet away. She tried not to shift under his gaze, but he just made her feel wiggly. It was both delightful and terrifying. Well, Miss Morris, he finally said, I'm sorry for this whole ruse, but I can't let you go until I've questioned you thoroughly and done a background check on you to make sure you're not a threat to us.
Lena skoffed lightly.
I don't even know who you are, she said, dumbfounded. She was the one that was taken. She didn't want to be captured by that creepy, pugnacious man, Manny. Ransom knelt down again and looked her in the eye. Once again, her body betrayed her. She gripped the arms of the chair with her hands, forgetting they were now free. She didn't feel threatened, but there was certainly something dangerous about this situation. What she initially thought was a petty mugging and beating was apparently something more. But just what had she witnessed? Who were those guys? Most importantly, who was this guy with the fierce, alluring eyes? Who are you? She asked. The man smiled at her, a deep dimple appearing on his right cheek. My name's Ransom. Lena almost laughed. Ransom, she repeated. Ransom as in money demanded for the release of a hostage? That seemed kind of ironic, yet somehow it fit him. What's your last name? Ransom let out a little huff of air, his grin deepening and making Lena's heart beat faster. I can't tell you that just yet, he said. If I told you I'd have to. Well, you know how the saying, Chapter 6, interrogation. She stared at him like she wasn't sure whether or not he was kidding. However, she still didn't seem too scared. This was surprising to Ransom because this wasn't a common reaction for someone facing him after he just joked about having to kill them. Maybe it was because she didn't fully understand who he was. Maybe she had no sense of danger. Regardless, he was surprised by her lack of response. It was a joke, of course. He didn't just go around killing people. Those kinds of orders came from higher up. Also, he didn't want to hurt her. He just wanted to see her reaction. All she had done was grip the arms of the chair she had been tied to. It was the most she had moved since he'd untied her. He had thought that she was easy to read, but part of her was a mystery to him. Why wasn't she afraid of him? Ransom surveyed her features. Her jaw was sharp and petite, and her lips were small but not thin with a pronounced Cupid's bow. Her nose was small and pointed, and her eyebrows had a slight arch to them. Together the angles of her face were striking and gave her that powerful scowl that she pulled off so well. She was quite beautiful. He hoped that she wasn't a threat. From what he'd heard from Manny and Mateo, she seemed like she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. They probably shouldn't have even grabbed her at all. If they just let her go and treated her like a normal civilian, then they wouldn't be in this situation. Ransom gritted his teeth at the thought of them shoving this beautiful girl in a car and tying her to a chair. He imagined how afraid she must have been, though she didn't appear scared now. Nobody went through that completely unafraid, but the fact that she seemed so cool and composed was a good sign, he hoped. From his past experiences, he knew people like that in her situation were usually very cooperative and didn't want the trouble. The scared people were more dangerous, more unpredictable. So Lena, I have a few questions for you before I leave, he said. She straightened up slightly in the chair. She locked her eyes on him in full attention. That was going to take some getting used to, he thought. Her eye contact was strong, and he'd never had anyone aside from his father meet his eyes so bravely before. This woman was a wonder. What were you doing before you came across my guys earlier tonight? He asked, using his best mafia underboss voice. I was going to my car on the 5th level of the parking garage, she said. Ransom nodded. And before that? Where were you coming from? Yoga class. Ransom figured that was the case. He remembered how she was clutching the yoga bag strapped to her chest as she charged through the cool March air when they'd passed each other on the street. Was that why she wasn't scared? Because she had seen him earlier? And where were you planning on going after you got to your car? Home, she answered simply. And what's your job? Where do you work? I'm a financial consultant for Green Consulting Company. Your age? 27. So she was only 3 years younger than him. 27, and he looked down at her left hand. Unmarried. Ransom sighed. He didn't want to question her like this. Felt too formal. He'd rather ask her about herself over dinner with a candle stuck between them and her foot rubbing against his calf. He shook his head to clear those ridiculous thoughts. He was a tough mafia boss. He wasn't supposed to fantasize about dinner dates. That wasn't manly enough. He cleared his throat. All right, well, before I can let you go, I'm going to run a background check on you. I hope you understand, he said, his gaze accidentally wandering down the length of her legs.
Lena nodded hesitantly.
She didn't seem like a threat in the slightest. Her in her emerald green leggings and her blondie band tee. But he had to be safe. If his father, the true boss, found out that he had let this woman go after just asking her a couple of simple questions, then he'd get his SS hooped. He doubted he'd find anything on her, but part of him selfishly hoped that he would find some dirt on her that would allow him to keep her there longer. So I have to stay in here then? Lena asked, glancing around the room. Ransom was aware that the basement/interrogation room was not the most comfortable place, and Lena especially did not look like she belonged there. Most people that found themselves in that room had broken a mafia rule or had been involved in a crime against the mafia. Sorry, Dalsetsa, he said, only feeling slightly sorry. He only felt bad for the room she was in and for the company she was keeping. He didn't feel bad for keeping her around. It's just for a little while. And I suppose Bozo and his buddy will be looking after me again? She sounded slightly annoyed, and her eyes were narrowing in distaste. Bozo Bobby actually works on the docks, but Manny, the guy you rightfully decked, will be outside of the door. His joke fell flat, and he huffed at himself when her expression didn't change. No worries though. I'll tell him not to enter if that makes you feel more comfortable. Lena twisted her mouth. And the other one? Mateo is a good kid. You don't need to be scared of him, Ransom said. He knew this wasn't a great situation for her to be in, so he wanted her to be as at ease as possible while she was here. Ransom turned away to leave, but he had to steal one more glance back at Lena. I'm going to step out. When I get back, you better have been on your best behavior, or you'll be in trouble when I come back, he said with a crooked smile that he couldn't hold back. Her face brightened with pink that reminded him of the sunset over the harbor, and her eyes darted away. It was funny how she seemed to be so bold with Manny and Mateo, But when he teased her like that, she froze up and got nervous. It was adorable, actually. Chapter 7. Can't be left alone. Lena's gaze followed Ransom closely as he left. With his back to her, she took a gander at him. He was tall and thick but not too bulky. She noticed the black ink of a tattoo on his right arm as he pushed up his long sleeves before exiting. After he shut the door, she heard a muffled, angry voice and a thud that slightly shook the wall. She hoped that was Ransom putting Manny or whatever his name was in his place. She didn't get a good vibe from him. But on the other hand, it seemed like Ransom at least felt a little bad about her situation. Now that Lena was by herself in the room, she was able to relax a little. It was draining to be so on edge and to remain so composed. She didn't fear Ransom, not yet anyway, but she did feel kind of intimidated by him. He was big. He was attractive. And apparently he called the shots in this place. She circled her neck slowly in both directions like she did when warming up for yoga. She massaged her wrists where the ropes had been tied and she stretched her arms out to the side and then over her head. Moving on to her toes, she began to wiggle them and roll her ankles gently in circles. She pressed up to stand, and her legs tingled with sleep. How long had she been there? How long was she tied to that chair? She patted her legs and waited for them to regain their feeling. Once she could take a sturdy step without her legs trying to buckle beneath her, she circled the room. It was quite large and it was bare. The walls and floors appeared to be made of concrete, and there was some piping in the corner. She assumed she was in a basement. But the basement of what? A house? A warehouse? All she knew was that she needed to get out of there if it was possible. Even if Ransom wasn't all that scary in her opinion, even if his presence and his gaze sent delightful shivers down her spine, she couldn't just linger in the lion's den. Lena wandered around the room, tapping on the walls and pressing her ear against their cool surface. She couldn't hear anything. But she did spot a window in the far corner of the room. She ran over to it. The window was fairly high and small, probably not more than a 25 by 25 inch square. And the glass did look pretty thick. She huffed, hoping that her hips and her butt could make it through there. There didn't appear to be a way to open it, but she could try breaking it. But before she tried that, she needed to make sure that the two guys guarding her wouldn't be able to get in there. She jogged over to the metal door and inspected it. She didn't have a way to jam the doorknob or anything. She grunted in anger. She would just have to try to break the window while they were distracted or something. Lena rapped on the metal door, and a voice piped up on the other side. "What do you want?" "I need a drink," she said. "You'll be fine. Shut up and sit tight." That was definitely the mean one. She heard a light murmur, probably the kid, and then the door cracked open. Mateo's face peeked through the crack. "We'll get you some water in a moment," he said before shutting the door again. She heard the door lock. The door was too thick for her to hear much, but she thought she could make out the sound of receding footsteps. She hoped that both of them were leaving. Either way, she was going to have to chance it. She dashed over to the chair and took it to the window. She placed it on the ground and stood on it. She banged on the window until her hands were red and sore. That wasn't going to work, she decided. So she got off of the chair and hefted it over her head. She lifted it as high as she could and slammed it into the little window. The sound was loud, but she kept going. The chair cracked against the window 3, 4 or 5 times before the window finally began to give in. She hit it again with all of her might 7, 8, 9 times. Then, with an exhaustion-fueled grunt, she slammed it one more time, and the chair exploded over her head. It rained shards of wood chips and splinters all over her. The window was barely cracked. Lena collapsed to the floor. Her arms were burning, and she was out of breath. Just as she was about to stand, the metal door flew open, slamming into the wall. Manny came running through it, and he charged towards her like an angry dog. "You better calm your lady," he said, grabbing her by the wrist and jerking her to her feet. A sharp pain shot through her wrist and up her arm. It was an automatic defense to try to hit him. Lena swung her free fist at his face, but he managed to dodge it. "This again?" He spat at her, yanking her towards him and restraining her arms behind her back. "I knew we shouldn't have left you alone. That's why I came back early." Mateo appeared in the room suddenly, holding a nice clear glass of water. He took a look around the room at the broken chair and the cracked window. His eyes were wide with surprise. "What's going on?" he asked. Manny shoved Lena forward, and she tumbled to the ground, catching herself on her palms. She yelped in pain as her hands and knees skidded across the hard floor. Then a low growl of frustration escaped her. She glared up at Manny, who seemed proud to have just tossed a girl half his size onto the ground. "Hey!" Mateo yelled, grabbing Manny's arm. "The boss said not to get rough with her. You were supposed to stay outside anyway. What are you going to tell him? I'm going to tell him I stopped this little brat from escaping, that's what. Lena rolled her eyes. I hope he kicks your SS for this, she muttered. Manny's eyes were aflame when he looked at her again. He walked over to her, and she expected him to kick her or hit her again, but he just bent down over her and sneered. I think it's best if you calm down, or the boss won't be happy when he comes back. You'll be better off if you just cooperate. There were 100 snide and quippy things she wanted to say, but she decided not to push her luck. It probably was better to wait for Ransom to come back, though she wasn't sure how he'd react once he saw that she'd tried to bust out of there. Finally, Manny left and waved for Mateo to follow him. Mateo set down the glass of water that was still in his hand, and gave Lena an apologetic smile. She didn't like the idea of just sitting there and basically admitting defeat, but what else was she going to do? Chapter 8. A glutton for punishment. Even though Ransom had a pretty good relationship with most divisions of the Philadelphia Police Department, he didn't like to get involved with them if the situation didn't call for it. He knew if he stuck his nose around there too much that he'd more than likely find himself in cuffs in a cell, or worse. But he had a couple of good buddies in the East Division. The trick was working out a good relationship all the way up the ladder. Working with the individual police officers didn't matter much since they were the equivalent of the soldiers in the mafia. They were just there to write tickets and follow orders. A step above them was Detective Alvarado. His job was to gather information to solve crimes, which meant he was the primary guy who talked to witnesses and informants and searched the records. He had access to the stuff that put people away for life, but if you were on his good side you could get out of pretty much anything because your evidence could just go away. He was a convenient friend to say the least. Captain Inez Watson was a sassy little powerhouse. She did a lot of desk work, but she did it well and everyone took her seriously. Even some of the higher-ups didn't mess with her because she had a reputation for being rough with anyone who messed with her. When she wasn't making grown men PSS themselves, she oversaw and coordinated all of the activities and operations within the police department. That included staying in contact with the other PPD divisions and outside agencies. James Erickson was the chief inspector, but Ransom didn't like meeting with him. He was a lonely man that talked too much and shared too much information about himself. Unfortunately, he was good at his job and he was a good connection to have, but if Ransom was working that high up the ladder, he usually just went to the commissioner. There was not a lot to be said about Henry Cool except that he was not very cool. At least not in the sense that made you want to be friends with him. That's what made him perfect for the role. He was a simple guy who liked money and was easily swayed by bribes. Not cool for the whole of PPD but pretty advantageous for the Giudice Mafia. Ransom reached out to the detective and met up with him on the east side of town next to the Delaware River. Detective Alvarado brought a slim stack of papers with Lena Morris information. He was literally holding her life in his hands, and he didn't like the way it made him feel. So what's this girl got to do with you? Detective Alvarado asked. Ransom shrugged. Just checking her out. She might have witnessed something she shouldn't have witnessed, and I just want to see what kind of person she is before I decide how to deal with her. The detective folded his hands over his chest, looking displeased. Don't do nothing stupid, Kay? Ransom snorted and waved the papers in the air. I never do, detective. I'll be in touch, he said before walking back to his car. The overhead interior lights in the car were hardly bright enough to see the paper, but as it turned out there wasn't much to see anyway. There were only 27 pages in her file. One for every year she lived. Lots of other people, the rich ones and the criminals alike, usually had hundreds of pages to capture their lives. Ransom flipped through Lena's information. It might have felt more like an invasion of privacy had he not told her that he was going to do this, and had there actually been anything other than what she'd already told him. The basics were all there: birth date, full name, job experiences, education level, even her social media game was weak. He searched through her pictures on her social media, but her activity was sparse. She only posted a few pictures over the last 2 years. There was one that stood out to him though. Seemed to be the most recent. It was of her and who he assumed to be her friend. Lena's hair was braided back and hanging over her shoulder. She was smiling a real smile that he had yet to see. Ransom chuckled to himself. Who is this girl? All in all, his impression of her was that she had an impressive academic career, and she'd been working hard to get to the job she had. He thought she was cute, and he was a little surprised to find that such a brave and fiery woman didn't seem to have much else going on. Unfortunately, she seemed pretty harmless, and he didn't see a reason why he should keep her captive any longer. He drove back to his house, and when he went down into the basement, Manny was pacing back and forth in front of the metal door. He'd been gone just a couple of hours, but Manny looked rugged like he'd been waiting for days. What's got you so agitated? Ransom asked. Manny pounded his fist into his own hand. That bye. He stopped when Ransom raised a warning eyebrow. She tried to escape. Ransom couldn't help but smile. What the hell, boss? Why does your face look like that? Manny asked, clearly feeling like he got kicked out of the sandbox on the playground. Ransom ignored him and went into the room. He stepped in and glanced around. Lena was sitting in the middle of the room with her knees tucked up and her arms draped loosely around them. Behind her, the chair she had been tied to was smashed to pieces, and the small window was cracked. You're a brave one, Ransom said, walking over to her. She looked up at him, annoyed. That was the first time she'd given him that look. What took you so long to get back here? That was a surprise, Ransom thought. Sorry to keep you waiting, Dulcetsa. Ransom felt a strange feeling go through him. Now that he was face to face with her again, he didn't want to let her go. It was the middle of the night, almost 2 o'clock. That wasn't an ideal time to let her go out on her own. He wanted to make sure she was safe. Lena got up suddenly, and that's when he noticed a faint bruise around her wrist along with cuts on her arm and hand. What happened this time? He asked, reaching out to her. She pulled her arm away from him before he touched her. DMN window wouldn't break, she said. Ransom couldn't hold in the laugh. His chuckle echoed throughout the room, catching Lena's attention and bringing a brightness back into her eyes. This woman. He was already in awe of her. I see that. This is why I buy the good stuff, he joked. I'm just impressed you actually tried to get out of here. Lena looked down at the floor. Her body language was different from before. She didn't seem quite as sure of herself. Yeah, well, what else was I supposed to do? She said. Ransom grinned at her. She still had some fire, she was probably just tired. You're a glutton for punishment, aren't you? He said. She peeked up at him again and he held her gaze. Tell me, are you a masochist? Chapter 9, follow me. Lena nearly choked on the lump in her throat. How could this man be so brash? She wasn't used to that type of behavior. She didn't experience it with her fiancé Brian, and she certainly didn't experience it in her place of work. Everyone was too professional for that kind of lewd talk. It made her face feel hot, and it caused her stomach to do some strange things. However, she didn't dislike it. I could always tie you back up, he teased. Lena bit her bottom lip to keep herself from saying anything or from making any involuntary suggestive sounds. Ransom smiled devilishly at her and then sighed, returning to earnestness. On a serious note, he added. But the bruise, what's that about? It wasn't there before.
Lena shrugged.
If I told you the kid did it, would you believe me?
No.
She huffed and crossed her arms, wincing when she bent her wrist. It seems like you already know. But I'm interested to see what happens to that guy after you find out that he disobeyed your orders and definitely got rough with me earlier. He grabbed me and shoved me down, she said matter-of-factly. Ransom growled quietly and looked back over his shoulder. Manny was peeking around the door at them, and his eyes were wide with guilt. He knew what he had done. Lena smirked at him. Manny flinched and ducked out of the doorway when Ransom turned around and strode towards him. He didn't shut the door all of the way, but Ransom stepped out of the room, and Lena could hear his low and angry voice carry through. You're on my last nerve, Manny. You know my rules about laying your hands on innocent people. And not only did you completely disregard that, you hurt her even after I told you not to touch her again. Manny's voice was a panicked stutter as he tried to spit out excuses. Lena felt a bit self-satisfied, a bit smug. Even if Ransom wasn't defending her, she was glad that Manny was getting raked over the coals for what he'd done to her. Even if she wasn't the one delivering the punches, verbally or otherwise, she was just glad he was getting what was coming to him. Now you better be finding a more forgiving capo to work under, because as soon as I have Russo deal your punishment, you'll be regretting every choice you made to disobey me. Now get your issue together before you get cut off completely, Ransom said with booming finality. He came back into the room and crouched down in front of Lena. That's all, she asked. I'll deal with him later, Ransom said. He'll get what's coming to him. I'm more worried about your injuries. Let's take care of those first. Lena looked down at her arms. There was a faint bruise surfacing on her arm where Manny had grabbed her. Her hands were a bit cut up from when the chair broke to pieces, and now that she was paying attention, it seemed like she had a splinter or two in her palms. He reached out, his hand hovering over her arm. Lena's heart jumped up into her throat at the possibility of his hand touching her, but she tried to remain placid. Ransom never laid his hand down on her, but he did lean forward to better inspect her. Some of this was my own fault, Lena said after there was silence for a bit too long. When the chair broke, it kind of scratched me. She opened her palm and looked closely at the lines. Sure enough, There was a splinter buried in the big crease in the middle of her palm. You have a splinter? Ransom asked. I think so, Lena said. Let's go, Ransom said, standing abruptly. Lena was confused. Go where? I'm going to bandage up your hand, he said.
Smon, dolceza, follow me.
Suddenly, Lena was afraid to move from her spot on the floor. Felt safe there. She didn't know where she was or who this man was. It certainly started to feel like some kind of criminal syndicate, and she wasn't sure what leaving that room meant for her. Noticing her hesitation, Ransom grinned at her and said with a teasing chuckle, You can trust me. She met his eyes, and something in their dark depth told her that she could trust him. She pressed off the floor and followed him. He walked slowly out of the door, not even bothering to look at or say anything to Manny or Mateo, who were both still standing there. Lena looked at Mateo and gave him a polite nod. Manny stared at her with hatred in his eyes. I've decided I wanted to ask you a few more questions, Ransom said as he went up a set of stairs. Let's go somewhere more comfortable where we can talk privately. I'll make sure to take care of your wounds while we're there. Lena followed Ransom through the basement halls and up another set of stairs. She had never seen a basement with 2 levels before, at least not in a house. Once they breached the top of the last set of stairs, Lena had to blink her eyes and pinch herself to make sure she wasn't dreaming. She found that they were in a really fancy house. Whatever room they just came out of had a ceiling nearly 3 times as tall as a regular house. There were massive paintings and expensive decor and furniture all around. It was nicely decorated with some aspects of old Italian culture, but the overall feel was luxurious and modern. Lena was in awe. She wasn't expecting to walk up the stairs and find herself in a mansion-like home. Lena was growing a bit nervous as she walked through the house. Just who was Ransom? Why did he have such a nice house? Was it even his house? He sure was walking around like he owned the place. What exactly was his job? What kind of boss was he? But the most prominent question in Lena's head was, is he single? While she noted that she herself wasn't single, she couldn't help but wonder. She watched him with acute focus as they made their way through the large house. His skin, his hair, his voice, this house. It all screamed Italian. A thought popped into her head about what he could possibly be doing for a job, but she didn't let herself entertain the idea for long. For one, that would be super scary. And two, Ransom swiveled around suddenly while she was zoned out staring at his broad back, and she slammed right into him. Feeling a sharp pain shoot through her chest, she grabbed her boob, which had made harsh contact with his elbow. But she released herself as soon as she realized Ransom was looking right at her, smirking at the positioning of her hands. She cleared her throat and apologized. The way he was looking at her made her kind of nervous but kind of excited. She couldn't help but stare back into his beautiful dark brown eyes. She had never seen eyes so attractive. Chapter 10. I once owned a chinchilla. Have a seat, Ransom said, pulling out one of the nice chairs from the dining room table. Lena nodded a polite thank you and carefully slid into the seat. Ransom pushed her chair in just slightly as she sat, and then let Lena make the rest of the adjustments herself. She hadn't caught the scent before, but when he pushed her chair in, she noticed his cologne. It was a musky, woodsy smell, probably teakwood mahogany. She liked it a lot. It made her want to breathe him in. I'll be right back, he said, as we went back through the door from which they had just come. He waved 2 fingers, and as soon as he walked out, 2 guards walked in. They were different people from the ones who had been in the basement with her. She wondered where Manny and Mateo were now. Perhaps they got a break. Perhaps they'd gotten in trouble. She wondered where Ransom was going. Where are you? She began to say, but he had already left her sight. Lena sat awkwardly at the end on the long side of the table. Her new guards, she presumed, didn't look at her, and they stood like the stone statues in the park. Lena tucked her hands under her thighs out of anxiety, and her leg bounced rapidly as she gazed around the room, wondering where exactly she was. She wasn't sure how long she had been knocked out for, but it couldn't have been too long. Surely, she was still in Pennsylvania at least. Pretty soon, Ransom came back into the dining room carrying a small white plastic case with a red cross on it. A first aid kit. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table and slid the first aid kit onto the table and took a seat. Oh, is that for me? Lena asked, growing slightly uncomfortable in the silence. Or did you? It's for you, Ransom said seriously. He opened the case and began to reach inside. Then, perhaps remembering that there were 2 other people in there, he turned around and waved the guards out of the room. Thanks, Lena said, for the first aid. She reached for the alcohol wipes, but Ransom closed the lid and pulled the case away. Lena froze in confusion. He just said this was for her, but now he wasn't letting her touch it? Ransom flicked a harsh gaze at Lena. I'll do it, he said. You don't have to. I said I'll do it. His voice was a little gruff, which confused Lena. He had just been talking to her and teasing her in the basement, but now his voice was different. In fact, ever since they'd left the basement and come upstairs, he'd been pretty quiet. She wondered if he was mad at her or just angry with his men. Okay, she said, a little afraid to oppose him. He was the clear boss around here, and she still didn't know what kind of business he was running. Ransom held out his hand palm up. Lena looked at it, not sure what he was wanting, and when he got impatient, he grabbed her hand gently and pulled it towards him. His touch was firm, but his hands were warm. Lena felt her face go red again as Ransom began rubbing the alcohol wipe carefully over the cuts on her hands and the one on her arm. Her whole arm tingled, and she was suddenly starting to feel very jittery. She focused on Ransom's face. He seemed very focused as he hunched over her hand. His mid-length curly hair came untucked from behind his ear and fell down to create a sort of curtain to hide his face, but Lena could make out the slight crease in his left brow. The alcohol was cool, but it stung on some of the deeper cuts. Random flipped over her hand and touched the sensitive creases of her palm with his fingertips. It was such a soft, mindful touch, but it tickled slightly, and she almost jerked her hand away. Sorry, Ransom said. He peeked at her from behind his hair, and she thought she saw a smirk on his face before he put his head back down to continue his work. Did he see her blushing? Did he sense that his light touches were driving her crazy and sending electric pulses through her belly and between her legs? Lena clenched her teeth and cursed herself. She had told Brian that she wanted to wait to be physically intimate, but the truth was that she really just didn't want to do it with him. She thought sex was a bit overrated and that it was just something people threw in books and movies for the butterflies in the belly effect. Sure, she found men attractive, and she thought about physical things sometimes, but she had never experienced butterflies in her own belly before. However, she was able to recognize them right off the bat. I thought you said you had some more questions for me, Lena said, hoping to distract herself. She squeezed her legs together and cursed herself for having such thoughts about a mystery man. Ransom let out a little amused huff of air. I want you to tell me about yourself, he said, his voice low and soft. His velvet voice made her feel like she had warm sand poured over her. It was warm with the illusion of being soft, but really it was a bit gritty. What do you mean? I already told you my name and age and occupation and all of that. You want my social security number too? Ransom looked up, wearing a smug smile. Maybe I already know that. Tell me something I don't know. Lena almost wanted to laugh. She was caught off guard by his little remarks like that because she couldn't tell if he was joking or not. But something about this whole situation made her believe that he could easily get her social security number if he wanted to. In fact, all he'd need to do to get it directly from her was put his hand on her B. You've got a splinter, Ransom said, reminding her thoughts not to veer off again. She cleared her throat and tried to ignore him. Maybe it would be better not to look at him at all, she thought. That was clearly what was making her think that kind of crazy stuff. She twisted her head to the side and looked at a great big painting on the wall. It looked familiar, like it might have been by someone famous. She didn't doubt that it was. You squeamish? He asked. Lena flinched, forgetting once again that he had asked her a question. What? Oh no, She didn't know what to say to him. She was just thinking about his hands. She was just thinking about the fact that he could probably easily find her social security number or buy a super expensive authentic painting. That he smelled good and she liked his hair? That his voice was like velvet? So does it hurt then? The concern in his voice sounded genuine, and Lena accidentally looked at his face again. There they were, those eyes. She'd never seen eyes so dark before. It was amazing how much brightness they held. He was looking at her with his head slightly cocked, his face turned up at her with a worried gaze. Her eyes traveled all over his face. She just couldn't help it now that he was so close to her, and they were in a more normal setting. He was so handsome, she thought. Ugh, why am I like this? She said in her head, rolling her eyes. Ransom scoffed lightly. Did you just roll your eyes at me? He asked with faux offense. You know I'm just trying to take care of you. Ht Lena thought. She hadn't meant to make that facial expression. She just meant to think it. It was meant for her anyways. She was rolling her eyes at herself. I once owned a chinchilla, she rushed to say. Ransom's eyebrows lifted slightly, and the corner of his mouth twitched with amusement. Is that right? Tell me more. Chapter 11 Mystery Directive. Lena stupidly rambled on about the chinchilla she had as a pet when she was 15. His name was Butterbean, but she called him Bean for short. He had brittle bones. He really liked goji berries, but they were kind of hard to find. He died because she tried to feed him corn but found out too late that chinchillas couldn't digest it properly. With every word out of her mouth she felt like a bigger and bigger idiot. But she liked the way Ransom's eyes were shining at her. "You're pretty cute," he said unabashedly. Lena's mouth was stuck partially open until Ransom closed the box of the first aid kit and snapped her back into reality. Honestly, this whole night felt like a dream. She might have thought that it was had she not once again felt the rush of electricity up her arm when Ransom touched her hand. "You're all set," he said. "Too bad about Bean though. He sounded like a cool dude." Lena let out a little laugh which made Ransom smile. He was so. A maid with dark, short hair walked in holding a tray with some food on it. Lena recognized her as a maid for the black pants and the white apron she wore. She just looked very maid-like and she behaved very maid-like. She set the tray on the table and stepped back away from the table, holding her hands neatly in front of her. "Thanks, Agatha," Ransom said without looking back at her. She nodded once with a little bow and left the room. The food smelled good, and it was making Lena salivate. She wondered if it was for her, but there was only one bowl and she didn't want to assume. She tucked her hands under the table and tried not to look at the food directly. If she did, she was afraid she'd be given away. But the smell of it was enough to make her stomach growl. "What is this?" Lena asked. Ransom pushed the tray towards her, the soup sloshing slightly in the bowl. "It's your dinner," he said. "Oh," she said. But she was suddenly nervous to eat it. Even though it smelled good and there were even a couple of little rolls on the side, bread was her favorite, she wasn't sure she should. She'd spent most of her night locked in a basement, and for half of that time she was tied to a chair. Before that, she'd been kidnapped and knocked unconscious. What if this was just Ransom's way of lulling her into a false sense of security before killing her with poison food? She glanced at the tasty-looking food. "Thanks, but I'm okay." Ransom laughed and pulled the tray to himself. He grabbed the spoon, scooped out a heaping spoonful of soup and fed himself. "See? Not a trick. Not poisoned or anything. Just a kind gesture," he said with an amused grin. With a hesitant hand, Lena pulled the tray back to her and looked into the soup. She bit her lip nervously. "Here," Ransom said, handing her the spoon. Lena took it. "Your lips." Ransom shrugged. "You want me to call Agatha back to get you a spoon?" "It's fine," Lena said, not wanting to bother the maid.
Ransom vočed Lena eate.
All the while his eyes were bright and watchful. It was making her a bit self-conscious, but she didn't really mind the attention. It made her feel admirable. "So do you have any family?" Ransom finally asked after Lena was almost done with the soup. She set the spoon down on the tray next to the bowl and picked up one of the rolls. She pulled a bit of bread off of it and popped it in her mouth. "Yes, it's just me and my parents." "Ah, so you've got both. Not a lot of people do these days," he said. Lena wondered about Ransom's parents. Did they know what he was doing? It sounded like he might not have had both either. She wondered which he was missing, but it didn't feel appropriate to ask. He was only asking her because he needed to know these things before he let her go. "Wait, should I be lying? Are you going to use this information against me somehow?" Lena asked with teasing speculation. Ransom gave her a crooked grin, a little dimple appearing for a moment before his smile fell. "Even if you were, I would find out the truth. But it's easier if you just start with that. Less of an inconvenience to me." Lena started to laugh, but the way he answered her made her hesitate. This was another one of those times she couldn't tell if he was joking or not. She tore off another piece of the bread and chewed it slowly. With smoldering eyes, he slid his gaze over her slowly. What was with that look? Lena gulped down her bread and shifted uncomfortably, squeezing her legs together again. She set the bread down and put her hands in her lap. "What kind of things do you do for fun besides yoga?" Ransom asked. What was with these questions? What was this? A date? What makes you think I do it for fun? Ransom smirked and rested his elbow on the table. He looked very cool, very nonchalant. She couldn't help but like being in front of him, even though he made her tingle and think impure thoughts. Even though he intimidated her a little bit. "Touché," he said. "So what do you do for fun then?" Lena thought about it. She might as well humor him and answer his questions. At least she would if she had an answer for it. Lena hadn't exactly made a habit of doing things for fun. Her life was mostly business and obligations to keep herself healthy and successful. "What, you don't have anything?" Ransom asked. "An interesting girl like you?" Something about his words set something off in her. She just felt angry all of a sudden. She crossed her arms and leaned back in her chair. This was ridiculous. What even was going on here? She wondered. With her stomach full and her hand bandaged, she had managed to regain her senses. This wasn't a dream. This was her current reality, even if she didn't quite understand what was going on. I'm confused by these mixed signals. What are you doing? She said with a bite to her words. Ransom's entertained expression faltered. One eyebrow raised slightly. What mixed signals? I'm just making sure you're okay, and I'm asking you questions. He also crossed his arms to mirror Lena. Have you gotten any negative signals from anyone besides that wannabe tough guy Manny?
Lena huffed.
No, she mumbled. She looked down at her lap. I guess not. Aside from the being kidnapped and held against my will. Ransom looked at her. His emotion was imperceptible. It was true though that Ransom had been particularly nice to her since he showed up. He'd untied her and bandaged her hand and even fed her. He had made her smile. And even Mateo had sort of stood up for her when Manny was bullying her. And he got her a glass of water. Sorry, she said. You don't have to apologize. In fact, you shouldn't. All you did was respond to a situation and get taken in by some amateurs who wanted a pat on the back for doing something thuggish. You did nothing wrong, he said. He started out serious, but he was smiling by the end. I'm proud of you for kicking Oel Manny in the crotch though. I wish I could have seen that. Lena took a deep breath. Fine, she said haughtily. Then I'm not sorry. Ransom chuckled and relaxed his arms back on the table. His knee brushed hers underneath the table and his eyes were agleam. How could he do that? How could he go from confident mysterious bad guy to flirty mysterious hot guy? It was seriously annoying. Lena shook her head, failing to keep her thoughts in line. You know what I mean. By now I've figured out that you're not just some random guy, so tell me, who are you? And what are you going to do to me? Ransom rubbed his bottom lip with his thumb and gave her a seductive look. A playful smile took shape on his lips. What do you want me to do? Chapter 12. I can't let you go yet. Ransom was enjoying hearing about Lena, and he hungered to know more. He was aware that it was getting later and later, and he needed to let her get back to her life soon, but he just couldn't bring himself to say goodbye just yet. He liked the way she twirled the bits of her hair that had fallen loose from her ponytail, as she spoke about her chinchilla named Bean. She was so cute when she gave too much information because she felt awkward and didn't know what else to do. If it hadn't been for her, he might have never learned what shape chinchilla poop was. Most of what she said was useless information, but he clung to every word that slipped out of Lena's perfect lips. But just when Ransom thought he'd managed to get Lena relaxed, she started to freeze up. He wondered what he had said to make her shut herself off all of a sudden. She spoke sharply when she told him that she was getting mixed signals. She retorted sassily when he asked her if she'd experienced anything negative from anyone besides Manny. That shoal. But he almost had her back to her adorable flustered self. Almost. Lena pursed her lips and gave Ransom a narrowed gaze that attempted to hide the thrill of the double meaning of his question about what she wanted him to do to her. He wasn't sure what it was, but there was something about her that had his skin buzzing and mind going down dirty little gutters. He yearned to see the heat rise up her neck and into her cheeks. He longed to witness her nervously bite the fullness of her bottom lip. She fidgeted and tried to remain serious. I mean it, she said. Are you going to hurt me? It wasn't hard to see that question coming, but it still hurt him. It sent a prick of pain into the pit of his stomach. Considering her experience with him and his guys up to his point, it was understandable that she'd be curious about this. But his gut churned at the thought of her not feeling safe with him. I don't want to hurt you, Ransom said. That doesn't mean you won't, Lena responded coldly. People do a lot of things they don't want to do just to save face. Ransom shifted forward in his chair and rested his hand near Lena's elbow. He wanted to touch her, graze her skin lightly and comfort her. But he'd only known her a few hours, and she was kind of his hostage, so that didn't seem appropriate or welcome. Still, despite all of that, he wanted her to trust him, even though she shouldn't. Ransom had no intention of hurting her. He really didn't like to hurt anyone. It was just how he was raised to keep control of his guys, to keep control of the family money. Lena, Ransom said, his voice coming out more like silk than he'd intended. I know you have no reason to trust me, but I don't want to hurt you and I won't. I'll stake my life on that. He wasn't sure what had made him include those last few words, but he'd meant them. Whatever it was about her that drew him to her was strong. He didn't understand it, but he wanted to welcome it as crazy as it was. With that being said, he continued, I can't let you leave yet. Lena gasped defiantly and crossed her arms. What do you mean? He couldn't say that he just wanted to keep her around a bit longer, and talk to her some more. That would probably be off-putting for her. So he made something up that wasn't a complete lie. It's dangerous around here, especially at this time of night, he said. Lena looked around the room. What time is it anyway? Ransom looked at his silver Rolex. It's 3:42. Lena chewed on the inside of her cheeks and leaned back into the chair. She seemed upset, but her face began to soften into resolution. So are you going to send me back to the dungeon for the night? She asked. Her voice was steady. She joked, but she was expecting him to say yes. She was already expecting him to go back on his word. She probably thought that a thug like him would make her suffer. But he wasn't Manny. I'll take you to the police station in the morning. You should get some sleep for now, he said before she could make up her mind that he was a bad guy. In the meantime, you can stay in a bedroom upstairs. Stay in a bedroom? Ransom nodded and stood up from the table. He nodded towards the door, gesturing for Lena to follow him. With only slight hesitation, Lena stood and began to follow Ransom through the doorway. He was surprised when she followed behind him without a word as he led the way through the huge house, going up another set of stairs and pausing at the end of the hallway. His room was just to the left, the first room on this end of the hallway. He peered inside at his sloppily made bed. What the hell am I thinking? He said in his mind. It wasn't right for him to let his mind wander like that. Lena was a stranger who had accidentally been brought to him, and tomorrow she would be getting back to her normal life. Besides, no matter how many times he flirted with her and made her blush, there was no way she'd voluntarily stick around if she found out the truth about him, and he wasn't about to take advantage of her. He'd never do that. Plus, he'd prefer, just as he'd done his whole life, to wait for a girl who he could tell all about his life before taking her to bed. Ransom took a deep, quiet breath. He would take her to the opposite end of the hall. He'd give the key to Agatha. It was strange, probably borderline creepy, to keep her overnight under the guise of protecting her from the night, but he wasn't going to hurt her or anything. He would take her to the bedroom and just let her sleep there. She could freshen up if she wanted. He wanted her to be comfortable, and then she could go back to her normal life in the morning, and she would never have to see him again. You have a very nice house, Lena said as they started down the hallway. Very Italian. Ransom laughed unironically. He wanted to tell her that it looked that way because it was Italian. His great-grandfather was born and raised in Naples. Thank you, he said, not elaborating on the details. She didn't need to know who he was. It would be better if she didn't know anything about him. So how'd you get rich? Lena asked bluntly. Ransom nearly froze mid-stride. She certainly didn't need to know that either. If she found out that he was the underboss of the Guidus Mafia and that his father was the big boss, she would be repulsed by him. She would probably be terrified. No, he couldn't tell her that. Not in detail. Family money, I guess, he said. Lena hummed as if she were unamused. So what do you do for work then? I heard those guys refer to you as their boss. Ransom's blood felt like it thickened in his veins. Should he have been more careful? Was it okay to let these questions go unanswered? He swallowed a lump in his throat and opened the door to one of the guest bedrooms. You can sleep in here, he said, deciding to ignore the question and hope to get away with it.